The rain had started softly, misting the sidewalks and painting the world in muted grays. It felt fitting somehow, like the weather mirrored the emptiness brewing inside me. I walked aimlessly, my umbrella hanging uselessly at my side, too lost in thought to care that my shoes were soaked. What do you do when everything you've wanted for years turns into something you no longer recognize? When the person you've imagined spending your life with is suddenly a stranger. I replayed the scene in my head. I'd opened the door quietly, as I always did, expecting to find silence or maybe the sound of the TV in the background. Instead, I found them, my fiancé and my best friend, locked in each other's arms, as if the world outside didn't exist. The thing that startled me most wasn't their betrayal. It wasn't the infidelity or even the audacity of it happening in our apartment, our home. No, what unsettled me most was my own reaction. Or rather, the lack of one. I hadn't screamed. I hadn't confronted them. I hadn't cried. Instead, I'd turned and walked out, quietly closing the door behind me. The weight of what I'd seen barely registered. It was like I'd stepped into someone else's life, someone else's drama. The betrayal should have torn me apart, yet all I felt was nothing. I stopped walking and sat down on a bench in the middle of the park, staring blankly at the empty path ahead of me. The rain began to pick up, droplets soaking through my coat and pooling in the creases of my hands. But I didn't move. I thought about how hard I'd worked to make this wedding perfect. The countless hours spent comparing flower arrangements, debating color schemes, tasting cakes. I thought about the dress waiting for me back at the studio, a masterpiece of lace and silk that had taken months to design. And now, none of it mattered. How long had I been feeling this way? This numb, hollow indifference? As the rain poured down harder, I realized something chilling. The wedding wasn't the only thing I was indifferent to. I was indifferent to him. My fiancé. The man I was supposed to marry in less than 2 weeks. The next day, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing incessantly on the nightstand. Texts, missed calls, voice messages. From him. From her. From family. I ignored them all. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring out the window as the morning sun broke through the clouds. My reflection in the glass was unfamiliar, a stranger with hollow eyes and a faint furrow in her brow. I knew I needed to make a decision. The wedding was days away, and I couldn't keep walking through life like a ghost, pretending everything was fine. I glanced at my phone again. One message stood out. It was from my fiancé. We need to talk. Please. I should have felt something. Anger, sadness, resentment. But all I felt was tired. I didn't have the energy to play the part of the heartbroken fiancé. That afternoon, I finally mustered the strength to return to the apartment. I half expected to find him there with some prepared apology, but the place was empty. The air was heavy with the faint smell of his cologne and something else. Guilt, maybe. I sat on the couch, staring at the neatly stacked pile of wedding invitations on the coffee table. All the names, all the expectations. What would people say if I cancelled? If I walked away from the man I'd been with for 3 years? And yet, what kind of life would I have if I didn't? When he finally came home that evening, I was ready. We need to talk, I said, mirroring the words he'd texted me earlier. He froze in the doorway, his face pale. I can explain. Don't bother. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. I could tell he hadn't expected this, hadn't expected me to be so calm. I know about you and her, I said quietly. I saw you. He sank into the chair opposite me, running a hand through his hair. It was a mistake. I swear. It didn't mean anything. I almost laughed at the predictability of it all. The same tired excuses, the same hollow promises. It didn't mean anything? I echoed, my voice sharper than I intended. You're sleeping with my best friend a week before our wedding, and it didn't mean anything? I messed up, he said, his voice cracking. But it's you I love. It's always been you. Love. I said, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. Do you even know what that means? Because I don't think I do anymore. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, I wondered if I should feel something, anything. Anger, sadness, regret. But all I felt was a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. I can't marry you, I said finally. His head snapped up, panic flashing across his face. What? No, you don't mean that. We can fix this. We can go to counseling or... No, I interrupted. I'm done pretending. I'm done feeling nothing. You've been a stranger to me for months, and I've been too afraid to admit it. He reached for my hand, but I pulled away. This isn't about her, I said, standing up. This is about us. And whatever we had, it's gone. The days that followed were a blur of cancelled vendors, awkward phone calls, and tearful messages from relatives who couldn't believe the wedding was off. Are you sure about this? My mother asked for the 100th time. Yes, I replied, my voice steady. I'm sure. Surprisingly, it wasn't as hard as I thought it would be. Once the decision was made, a strange sense of relief washed over me. For the first time in months, maybe even years, I felt like I could breathe. I moved out of the apartment and stayed with a friend while I figured out my next steps. The dress, the flowers, the venue, they didn't matter anymore. What mattered was finding myself again. One afternoon, as I was packing up the last of my things, I found a photo of us from our first trip together. We looked so happy, so in love. I stared at the picture for a long time before finally slipping it into a box. That part of my life was over. It was time to move forward. 6 months later, I found myself walking through the same park where I'd first met him. The trees were just beginning to bloom, their branches heavy with pink and white blossoms. I sat on a bench and watched the world go by. Families with strollers, couples holding hands, joggers with headphones in their ears. Life went on, as it always does. I thought about everything that had happened, the betrayal, the heartbreak, the emptiness I'd felt for so long. And then I thought about the woman I'd become because of it. I was stronger now. Wiser. I'd learned to let go of things that no longer served me, even when it was painful. As I sat there, a man walking his dog stopped in front of me. He smiled, a friendly, unassuming smile, and nodded. Nice day, isn't it? He said. I nodded back, smiling softly. It is. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something stir in my chest. Not love, not yet. But hope. The wedding that never happened was no longer a tragedy. It was a turning point, a chance to start over, to rebuild, to find myself again. And that was worth everything. The man with the dog walked away, leaving me to my thoughts. His casual friendliness lingered in my mind, not because it stirred anything romantic, but because it reminded me how simple human connection could be. No expectations, no drama, no betrayal. Just a fleeting moment of kindness. That night, as I unpacked the last of my boxes in my new apartment, I stumbled upon a familiar sight. My wedding journal. I had poured months of planning into that thick leather book, filling its pages with fabric swatches, seating charts, and handwritten vows. I traced my fingers over the cover, the weight of it heavier than I remembered. Sitting cross-legged on the floor, I opened it. Each page told the story of a life I no longer recognized. A color palette of soft blues and whites. A seating arrangement designed to keep warring relatives apart. The vows I had agonized over, trying to find words that captured feelings I hadn't realized were already fading. And then, at the very back, a picture of the wedding dress I had so carefully designed. It was stunning, a cascade of lace and silk that seemed to shimmer on the page. I remembered how excited I had been to try it on, how I had imagined walking down the aisle to the man who, at the time, I thought was my forever. A lump formed in my throat, but no tears came. Instead, I closed the journal, set it aside, and reached for a trash bag. It was time to let go. Over the next few days, I felt a growing need to write. Not to him, but to myself, the version of me who had been so caught up in planning the perfect wedding, the perfect life. Late one evening, I sat at my kitchen table, pen in hand, and let the words spill out. Dear me. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I ignored your instincts, your doubts, your quiet cries for help. I'm sorry I let you stay in a relationship that made you feel small, invisible, and unloved. You deserved better, and I didn't protect you the way I should have. But I want you to know that it's okay now. You're free. Free to rebuild, to rediscover, to grow into the woman you were always meant to be. You don't need anyone's approval or validation. You're enough, just as you are. Love. Me. I folded the letter and tucked it into the back of my journal. I didn't need to throw everything away. Not yet. Some parts of my past were worth keeping, if only to remind myself of how far I'd come. A few weeks later, I received an invitation in the mail. It was from Claire, one of the mutual friends my ex-fiancé and I had shared. She was hosting a small dinner party and wanted me to come. I hesitated. The thought of seeing people who had been so intertwined with my old life felt daunting, like walking into a room filled with ghosts. But Claire had always been kind, and I didn't want to isolate myself any further. When I arrived at her apartment, the air was warm and inviting, filled with the smell of roasted garlic and laughter. Claire greeted me with a hug, her eyes sparkling with genuine happiness to see me. "You look amazing," she said. "Thanks," I replied, smiling. "I feel lighter." The evening passed in a blur of conversation and wine. People asked polite questions about my life, and for the first time, I felt no need to explain or defend myself. I was simply me, untethered from the expectations of who I used to be. Toward the end of the night, Claire pulled me aside. "There's someone I want you to meet," she said, a mischievous glint in her eye. Before I could protest, she was dragging me across the room to a tall, sandy-haired man with kind eyes. "This is Matt," she said. "Matt, this is Emily," he finished, smiling. "We've actually met before." I blinked, trying to place him. "The coffee shop on 4th Street, he said. "You were behind me in line, and you let me take the last muffin." Suddenly, it clicked. "Oh, right. You promised to buy me a muffin the next time we ran into each other." "Well," he said, holding up a glass of wine, "I'm afraid they don't serve muffins here, but I owe you one." I laughed, a genuine, unguarded laugh that felt foreign and wonderful all at once. Over the next few weeks, Matt and I started seeing more of each other. At first, it was casual. Coffee here, a walk there. He was funny, thoughtful, and refreshingly honest. But what struck me most about Matt was how he made me feel seen. For the first time in years, I felt like someone was truly paying attention, not just to what I said but to who I was. One evening, as we walked through the park, he turned to me with a question that stopped me in my tracks. "What do you want, Emily? Not from me, not from anyone else. Just for yourself." I stared at him, the words caught in my throat. No one had ever asked me that before. Not like this. "I don't know," I admitted finally. "I've spent so long trying to fit into someone else's idea of a perfect life that I don't even know what my perfect life looks like." Matt nodded, his expression soft. "Then maybe that's where we start." 6 months later, I stood in my apartment, staring at a familiar box. Inside was my wedding dress, still wrapped in tissue paper, untouched since the last fitting. I had thought about selling it, donating it, even burning it in some dramatic act of closure. But now, as I lifted the lid and ran my fingers over the delicate lace, I felt none of the bitterness I'd once carried. This dress wasn't a symbol of failure or betrayal. It was a reminder of who I used to be, and how far I'd come. I folded the lid back down and slid the box into the corner of my closet. Maybe one day I'd find a use for it. Maybe I wouldn't. Either way, it didn't matter. Later that evening, Matt came over with takeout and a movie. As we settled onto the couch, he handed me a paper bag. "What's this?" I asked. "Open it," he said, grinning. Inside was a muffin. I laughed, shaking my head. "You really didn't have to." "I know," he said, leaning closer. "But I wanted to." And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. Not because of Matt, or anyone else, but because I had finally chosen it for myself. The life I had now wasn't perfect, But it was mine. And that, I realized, was more than enough.